So November is the beginning of, well, it's kind of the end of the bee season in a lot of the country. We start getting those cold fronts coming in, and it's, beginning to be the time where, we really start focusing on next year, really, and what can we do to our bees to make sure they're ready to survive the winter and emerge next spring vibrant, ready to grow, ready to split if you want to make splits, etc. Before we jump into our live in the bee yard video, a couple quick announcements. We've got an awesome TBS monthly magazine coming up, or that just came out. Sherry, did you want to mention anything about the magazine this month? I didn't give you a heads up on that.
I do. You know what it is too? It's because you spoke, the people out there in virtual land, and asked for us to be able to initiate for you to be able to download the magazine as a PDF. You spoke, we listened, and we have dug in the inside of the virtual world, and we have got that where you can do that now. So there is now a new icon on the left-hand side when you pull up the magazine on our website, and it's the download to PDF. So you asked, we did it.
Thanks for pulling that off, Sherry. I know a lot
You're
of folks
welcome.
are excited to see that feature. So as you guys know, we are now taking pre-orders for our bees, whether it's our nooks, our complete hives, or our packages. They are all available for pre-order. And of course, we have, as always, pickup locations in Dallas, Houston, or now Austin. Speaking of Austin, we have a pretty exciting announcement that may not come as much of a surprise to some of you, but we are opening another branch of TBS in Austin in mid-2022. And so it'll be just outside of Austin. It's in Elgin, on the Austin side of Elgin. So it's only, it's kind of a little bit to the east of Austin, and it's super convenient, whether you're north or south of Austin. It's right off of a major highway. And so we are beginning construction on that facility, and we will be doing bee pickups this spring at that facility. It probably won't be done until mid 2022. We're trying to get it done by spring of 2022, but any of you that are following supply chain issues with COVID, and it's ridiculous how long a lot of things are taking to get done. But 2022, we will be opening an Austin area branch for TBS. So we can't wait to see all of our Austin friends in person. Okay, last announcement we have before we jump into our material. We have a virtual Business of Beekeeping class coming up on November the 13th. That's on a Saturday, 9:30 to noon, and it's $29 per person. We're going to be talking about how to actually make money in beekeeping. So transitioning from a small scale to sideline to commercial beekeeper, diversifying your business with products other than just honey, how to sell products at on websites, farmers markets, grocery stores, etc. So we're going to be kind of taking a broad overview of how to grow in the beekeeping business, and then how to turn a profit on a sideliner or commercial scale. So love to see you at that if you are interested. Okay, so with that, let's jump out into the bee yard. I filmed this just a few minutes ago, literally. I filmed it right before it got dark and ran in and uploaded the video. So this is hot off the press. Let's jump out to the bee yard and see what the bees are doing now that we are in November.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So it's a beautiful November day out here in the bee yard. The weather is pretty gorgeous. We've had a couple cold days earlier this week. This week, towards the last half of the week. Today's Thursday, it's been in the 60s. It's going to be in the 70s next week. You can still see the grass and trees are green behind me. So it'll be really interesting to take a look at these bees today and see what they're doing, because we've kind of had some of those cold spells come through that we expect to see in late October, November, and now it's warming up again. So really a pretty normal weather pattern, but we're really going to take a look at today, what their population looks like. Do they have enough food? and go over what do we want to see and what do we not want to see this time of year in November. So we're going to jump through some of these hives pretty quickly. We're not going to spend a lot of time in them because there's not a lot we can do this time of year, but I'm doing kind of that health checkup before it gets really cold is always a great idea. So we're going to jump on in. Okay, let's take a look at this first hive and see what's going on. Now, I'm going to talk about this a lot this time of year, but my favorite way to assess the population of a hive is right when I open the lid before I give them any smoke. Because once you start giving bees smoke, all the bees start running down in the hive and it gets hard to tell what the population is like. So right when I open the lid, I want to take a look at the population. So I've got some bees on the inner cover, pretty good sign. And check out these top bars. You can see that these top bars are almost completely covered with bees. You know, I've got, if you look down between the frames, I've got, you know, between every single frame, I can see nothing but bees, which is an awesome sign. That means that this is a box pretty much full of bees. It's exactly what I want to see for this time of year. Now this hive is a medium box and a deep box. We still have the beetle traps on here. That's really unnecessary once you get into, you know, fall and winter. I would recommend pulling those off and reinstalling them, you know, March, April time frame. So this is a medium box, and I know that it's not going to have much but honey in it. So I'm not really going to spend a lot of time looking at it, but I am going to break the two boxes apart and get a feel for how much honey's in it. And it's just by lifting it, I can feel that it's completely full of honey. So they've got a good 40 pounds of honey stored up in the second medium box, which is all that they need for winter. You can see looking at the underside of this box, it's just completely full of bees. And then looking down at the bottom deep box, you can see that it is almost completely full of bees as well, looking down at these top bars. So this is an awesome hive. I mean, we're going to take a look and see if they're doing anything in the brood box. But I mean, as far as population goes, I would say this is a phenomenal hive. I mean, you've got a medium box full and a deep box full, which is kind of exactly what we want to see going into the winter, best case scenario. So let's take a look and see what, if anything, is going on down in the brood box. Now, I did see, right when I was setting up for this video, I did see a bee fly into the entrance of this hive with pollen on her legs. So they are still getting a little bit of pollen from somewhere. I don't have any idea where. But you know, we really haven't had a freeze yet. And so until we get that first freeze, I would expect to see, you know, a trickle of pollen coming in. And the weather's been pretty warm, so okay, so we have a frame, and this is just a very typical good brood frame. So we basically have, I'll show you, we've got a little bit of cap brood on this frame with a lot of the bees emerging. So you may not be able to see, yeah, you can see some there in the center. A little bit of cap brood, most of it's emerging, and then most of the cells are empty in this frame, but there are a few cells full of eggs and larvae, but it's only in about a softball size area. So that's really common this time of year to see frames with some cap brood that's hatching, and you know, a few softball size areas where the queen is laying again, but you know, you're not seeing typically whole frames full of eggs and larvae. So this frame is about the same, a little bit of cap brood being replaced by some eggs and larvae, but not a lot, just a little bit of eggs, a little bit of larvae. I'm seeing some stored pollen, which is something you always want to watch for. You know, I'm seeing, you know, 20 or 30 cells with pollen in it in every frame. This frame, they started filling it with nectar, or you know, honey or nectar. You may not be able to see, there's so many bees on here, but they've got liquid honey they've probably pulled down out of the top box, storing it in this bottom frame. Essentially what they're doing is they're arranging the brood nest how they want it for winter. So they've got a couple frames of brood, and then they're starting to pull honey down into the bottom box from the top box to get them in their winter configuration that they want to see. So this next frame has a lot more honey in it. It's almost completely honey, a little bit of brood in the middle, but mostly honey. So really the configuration the bees have created for themselves is exactly what I would want to see. You've got about 5 or 6 frames that are mostly honey in the bottom box with some space still in the middle. And then you've got a couple frames of brood cumulatively that, you know, I would expect to see in a hive this strong that's kind of winding down. So I would say this hive is really just a perfect example of a hive that is ready for winter. You know, we've got our mite counts really low. We've got a medium box completely full of honey. The bottom box has 5 or 6 frames of honey in it. The only thing I'm going to do to this hive is I'm going to give them a couple pollen patties just to finish out the month, and they're good to go till spring. So let's take a look at this hive. The last hive we looked at was, you know, it was kind of all rainbows and butterflies. This hive, from the little peek I've gotten, I don't think it's going to be the same. I think we've got some issues with this hive. So right off the bat, you can see these top bars. They aren't very covered with bees. You know, I can look down between and I can see that, you know, we've got a couple frames with bees on it, but in general, there's not a lot of population up in this second box. This hive is 2 deep boxes. And so when I pull up some frames, you know, that's just a beautiful frame of capped honey. We've got plenty of honey. Look at that. Just a gorgeous frame of honey, but not a lot of bees. And about half of this box is foundation. So you can see this frame isn't drawn out mostly. So the middle 1, 2, 3, 4, the middle 5 frames are drawn out and are completely full of honey, which is about, you know, 30 to 40 pounds of honey. So they've got plenty of honey, especially for this small of a hive, but not a lot of bees up here. So let's see what's going on below. So down below, you can see that we've got some bees, but not just a whole lot. Let me show you this population a little more closely. You're gonna have to bear with my videography skills. There you go. So you can see there's, you know, really only about 4, maybe 5 frames covered with bees. So let's take a look and see if we can figure out if there's an issue or if they just dwindled for some reason, which often happens with bees. They've got a pollen patty that they've eaten a little bit of. Let's see if they've got any brood at all, and see if we see any pollen or any reason that this hive is so much smaller. I would say this hive is on the verge of one I would consider combining with another. I'd say they've probably got 4 to 5 frames of bees. I'm gonna leave them for another month, and if they continue to shrink, then next month I'll combine them. So I've got some decent bee population on some of these bottom frames. I've even got some brood. So I've got some larvae, eggs and larvae. So they've got a queen, which is a great sign. You can see it's not much, but they do have some eggs, and they do have some capped brood and larvae, which is always good to see this time of year. It's not a great pattern, but that's kind of to be expected this late in the year. So, you know, they've got a queen. If they were queenless, then I would probably go ahead and combine them with another hive since they're weak. But they've got a queen, she's laying. They've got about 5 frames of bees, which is right on the verge. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave them. And if they're, I'm gonna say down to 2 or 3 frames of bees a month from now, I'll combine them. But if they kind of can maintain those 4 or 5 frames of bees through the next 6 weeks or so, then I'll leave them be and they'll probably pull through to next year. Okay, I want to go over really quickly just how I would do a late fall, or November in this case, or winter inspection. And I just want to do it really quickly so you guys get a feel for what I do with my bees anyway. I don't spend a lot of time in them. If it's a nice warm day that's, say, 45 or above and sunny, then I like to go out and do an inspection on my bees. If it's windy and cold and under 50, I tend to not look at them. But if it's bright and sunny and 45 or more, or even below that, I'm okay checking them if it's pretty quick. And so the main thing I'm often looking for is population and food stores. And if both of those are okay, I don't look any further. If I see a problem, like, oh, there's almost no bees, or, oh, they're really light, then I have to take action. But assuming that's not the case, I just take a really quick look and off I go. So I pop the lid, look quickly at the population under the lid. If I can get the lid off. So population looks great. I've got lots of bees all over the top bars. These are 2 deep boxes, and I've probably got 8 frames of bees. Put the lid right back on, close it up, and then I'm going to crack the 2 boxes apart, the 2 deeps apart. So crack those apart. I'm going to tilt it up on end. Look at population. So I've got probably 6 frames of bees in that bottom box. I can see from the underside of this top box that I've got a good 8 frames up there. Population looks great. Because I lifted up this box, I can tell that they've got 50, 60 pounds of honey up here. So I'm done. So less than a minute, and I see they've got plenty of food, plenty of population. They don't need my help. They're good for another month.
Okay, so there you go. That's our in the bee yard for this month, and I tried to cut a little bit short so that we can get to our panel and have plenty of time for our panel coming up in just a few minutes after I do a little more monthly November tips. So I'm going to go over a handful of topics, and then around 7 to 7:10, we are going to go to a panel of 4 or 5 beekeeping experts, and we are going to give you guys the opportunity to ask them the hardest, most difficult beekeeping questions that you can possibly think of. And they're going to be able to answer them all, no problem. So go ahead and start thinking of questions that you have, especially as they pertain to fall and winter management. And then I have a lot of questions too that I'll ask them, and it'll just be kind of a panel discussion, if you will, about fall and winter management and other topics if you're interested. So you can go ahead and start putting those questions in the Q&A box. Just say for panel and then put your question, so James and Sherry know to just leave them. Or you can wait till the panel starts and we'll get those questions answered. So fall blooms. So the fall blooms are certainly dwindling. Like I mentioned in the video, I was surprised to see a handful of bees with pollen on their legs as they were coming into the hives. And, there's certainly more pollen coming in Southeast Texas than there is in far North Texas, but there is still a little pollen coming in. By and large, though, most of the major fall pollen producing plants have died. The goldenrod's pretty much gone, the broomweed's pretty much gone, the aster's pretty much gone. So whatever is left is really just a slight final trickle before we get that first freeze, and it largely kills off most of the plants. So kind of what I'm seeing with current conditions, the end of the bee season is here, right? Question mark. It's midweek, it was chilly and rainy and it felt like winter. I think by Monday we're going to be back up into the upper 70s and low 80s, depending on where in the South you are. So, the cooler temperatures, though, when we do get those cold fronts, it definitely causes the bees to begin shutting down. And that's certainly what I'm seeing in my hives. I'm not seeing hives with 8 frames of brood anymore. I'm seeing them with, you know, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 frames of brood, and they're starting to shrink down the brood nest, etc. Minimal pollen flow, rapidly coming to an end. You know, we're having major cold fronts and warmer weeks, and as a result of those major cold fronts, you know, we're really seeing the bees aren't really growing anymore. At best, they're maintaining a bit. This is what I'm seeing in hives. You know, when I look at the brood, I'm seeing a lot of honey around the outside edges of frames. They're kind of contracting down that brood nest area, which is great. That's what I want to see. That's what I expect to see. So that's perfectly normal. You're not going to see nearly as much brood this time of year, certainly as you are even a month ago. This is just a quick review. You know, we went over this a lot in our last webinar, which you can see on our website or YouTube, but keep in mind, this is what bees really need to successfully survive winter. They need 30 to 40 pounds of honey or syrup in their second box. Like you saw in that video, you know, that very first hive we looked at was a medium box, and it was completely full of honey. That's perfect. That's all the bees need. You need mites under 2 per 100 bees, sufficient bee population, at least 5 or 6 frames or more, and of course, a healthy laying queen. Final feeding, this is just a refresher. The goal is to maintain that 30 to 40 pounds of stores in the second box, and I'm going to say 3 to 6 frames of honey in the bottom box. And so that's what you're trying to maintain. If I have like that first hive we looked at in the bee yard today, I won't feed that hive at all. I mean, I actually don't think I ever fed that hive. That was from fall nectar that they packed out that medium. And then I won't need to feed them until spring. And so hives that already have that 40-pound surplus in the second box probably won't need any more food until spring, and they may not even need it then. If your hive has less than that, you know, if they've got if it's a strong hive, you know, a deep box full of bees or more, and they have less than 30 or 40 pounds in the second box, I would feed them 2-to-1 syrup. And, you know, as much as you can give them so they fill up that second box. You still have a window because it's still warm, the bees will still drink syrup. Once it starts getting cold, once we get those days in the 60s and 50s, the bees stop drinking syrup as much. If that happens, so if you've got a hive that does need food, then you have some options for winter feeding. Giving them a liquid syrup in a division board feeder or an entrance feeder just doesn't work terribly well because the bees have to travel outside their cluster to get the syrup. And on cold days, they don't really break their cluster much to go drink that syrup. So you can use sugar cakes or fondant right on the top bars of the beehive, like you see in that lower right-hand picture. You can use Ziploc bags full of syrup with little holes poked in the top of them. Right on top of the brood nest, you can put a chicken feeder full of syrup right on top of the top bars with an empty box around it. You know, you can also get frames of honey from another hive that has extra and put them on either side of the cluster. So remove some of the empty frames out of the brood nest, replace them with frames full of honey beside the cluster. You don't want to put them right in the middle of the cluster, but beside the cluster. The idea for winter feeding is it's helpful to get the syrup, or not the syrup, but the food directly in contact with the bees. They're right on top of the cluster or right beside the cluster. So the bees don't have to travel much to get the food. And so these methods are really helpful in achieving that. Pollen substitute, I feed 2 to 3 pounds of pollen substitute per hive in the month of November. And then I stop feeding after November. So I don't see much of a reason to feed pollen substitute in December. And then January, late January, sometimes I'll give them some. But you know, once the bees really start clustering, they don't need the pollen substitute. They're not rearing brood anyway. And so usually by late November, there's no need for pollen substitute. We did talk about entrance reducers and screen and bottom boards at our last October webinar. Just a reminder, if you're going to use entrance reducers, I will go ahead and put those on. You know, we're getting those cold snaps. It's getting cool enough to where it's not going to hurt the bees. So go ahead and put those on, and then cover your screen bottom boards, or at least block the sides of them so that the cold wind can't blow up underneath your hives. want to quickly, and we touched on this in the video, but I mentioned that, population checks are one of the most important things that I tend to do in the winter. I check the population, I check the honey stores, and I want to just show you guys some quick slides to remind you the best way to see the strength of your hive when you're doing a population check. And this is a great illustration of kind of what we saw in the video, which was when you open the lid of a hive, you can look down on those top bars and really you can see that cluster. You can really clearly see the size of that cluster in the hive. You can also look from the undersides of the frames, and that gives you an even better view of the size of the cluster. If you feel like your hive is weak, then here are some considerations before you combine your hive. Now, the Elam's talked a lot in our last webinar about all the details of doing a combination if your hive is weak. So I'm not going to get into too much of the weeds, but I just want to remind you of a few things, because November and when we start getting those cold fronts is when a lot of people look at their hives and go, oh, wow, these bees are not nearly as strong as I thought. Should I combine them? So keep in mind, temperature plays a big role in the population, the appearance of how populous your hive is. If it's 80 degrees and sunny, your hive is going to look tremendously different than if it's 45 degrees. When your bees are clustering, the colder it gets, the tighter they get into that cluster, and the fewer bees it's going to look like you have. When I'm trying to make a judgment call as to the strength of my hive, I really like to do it when it's about 60 degrees or above. And that really, the bees are not clustered so tightly that it's hard to get a read on their strength. Count the frames of bees, or the total of all frames of bees in all boxes. So if I say I've got a hive that's 8 frames of bees, I'm talking about deep frames covered at least 2/3 front and back with bees. And that's combining all the frames in the hive. And so, earlier when I said, I want my hives to be at least 5 or 6 frames of bees going into winter at a minimum, that would be 5 or 6 deep frames covered 2/3 front and back with bees. And you don't always have to pull the frames out to get that count. You can kind of look from the top and look from the bottom and see that cluster size. As far as doing a combination, there's a lot of different methods for doing it. And I recommend just putting a sheet of newspaper between the 2 hives you're stacking on top and combining them. The bees will chew through that newspaper, kind of get used to each other. I usually kill the queen in the weakest hive. So whatever hive was weakest, I kill that queen because theoretically she's inferior. And so I would kill that queen rather than let them fight it out, and maybe the weaker one kill the stronger queen. More often than not, I do kind of I call it a dirty combination of hives, where when I go out to my bee yard, if I've got a weak hive, a couple of weak hives, I just stick them together with no newspaper. I just take the deep box that has all the bees from hive A and combine it right on top with the deep hive box from hive B that is weak, and just stick them together. There's sometimes a little fighting of the adult bee population, but not much. It works pretty well in general. This is just a good visualization of a hive that I would say is about 4 frames of bees. So this is taking the lid off. And I think this hive was just a single box, so there were no additional boxes. And that's, about 4 frames of bees. You can kind of look down between the frames and see, where they are covered with bees and where they're not. This was last year. This was combining a bee yard that did particularly poorly in the fall. And this was just, combining a whole bunch of hives out in the bee yard. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. Just as a quick reminder, when it's time to remove excess boxes, refer back to the October webinar because we did go over this in some detail. But I essentially, if you've got more than 2 boxes on your hive, so if you've got a 3rd box and it's not full of bees, if it's less than 25% full of bees, and you've got plenty of honey stores in your bottom 2 box for the hive, then I typically pull off that 3rd box, usually about now, sometime in early to mid-November. If you've got 3 boxes and they're all mostly full of bees, just leave it. It's not going to hurt the bees if they're mostly full. When I start removing those upper boxes as if there's virtually no bees in them, then they probably don't need it. Just make sure your hive has plenty of honey down below. Okay, winter inspections, and we're going to get into this a little bit with the panel, but what to look for in November when I'm looking through a hive. I'm looking for brood and eggs. I don't expect to see much, but I like to see a little bit in November just to reassure me that I've got a good laid queen. I'm looking for pollen stores, pollen patty consumption, population, and honey stores. So those are the things I'm looking for when I'm out in my bees. We're going to go over this particular slide more later in the winter when it gets a little bit colder, but I'm going to give you a preview of it. The picture always gets questions, but this was actually doing splits at about 40 degrees in March several years ago when it was really cold in March. And so we actually had a little canopy we put up, and we have a little heater that blew heat onto the hives as we were doing splits, and then we would pick up the canopy and move it over another pallet and do splits. I don't know that, it made us feel a whole lot better. It kept it about 60 degrees in there where the bees were. Anyway, so essentially this is my guide as to when it's okay to look at bees and how long to look. If you're looking less than 1 minute and you're not pulling out frames, then it needs to be above 32 degrees. If you're looking for more than 1 minute and you're pulling out like a frame, then ideally it's sunny and above about 40 degrees. If you're pulling out several frames and maybe spending multiple minutes in the hive, I like for it to be sunny and above 50 degrees. Ideally, you're doing an inspection during the heat of the day, several hours before dark, to allow the hive to recluster. A lot of people are scared to look at bees in the winter, but it's better to do a quick population check and a quick food check than not. Starvation is going to hurt them a whole lot more than cracking it open in chilly weather. I've worked bees in the snow at 20 degrees before, and as long as it's brief, the bees handle it really well. So don't be afraid to do quick checks. Just make them quick and get in and get out, and make sure you've got your bees taken care of. Frequency of inspections, I usually do about twice per month, November through January. And some of those inspections are just cracking the two boxes apart, taking a look, shutting them, and moving on. Okay, so I got through with that probably too quickly, but if you guys can go back and watch the recording that we'll send out if I ran over any of that too quickly, but I really wanted to get to our expert panel. So I am going to introduce them, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you guys can go ahead and start putting questions for the panel in the Q&A box. And I will ask all the questions that I can. I'm sure we're going to have far more questions than we have time to get to. But I do have a couple starter questions as well. So if James and Sherry and Ashley and Justin and Lauren, if you guys want to share your screens, I will stop sharing my screen so we can just see all of you guys. And I will introduce you, and we will get this panel up and rolling. So
it's not allowing,
right.
just so you're not allowing us to do that.
Same here.
Okay, hang in there. I am making you guys co-hosts.
Thank
There
you.
go. And so now you guys can take over the meeting if you want to. So please, there we go.
Oh, look, you got a room full, Ashley.
For fan club?
All right.
Justin,
Ashley fan club?
I'm the least professional.
Hey, Lauren.
in background.
Hi,
Hey.
Hey, that's okay. So
Can we ask each other questions?
Yeah, well, yes, you can, as long as they're beekeeping related.
Yeah.
So you guys all know James and Sherry. They are our beekeeping experts that are with us every webinar that answer all of your questions. And then they are fantastic beekeepers, as you guys well know. And then under Ashley Ralph there, we have Ashley Ralph, who's the president of the Texas Beekeepers Association, and which we have a conference starting tomorrow. and she's a phenomenally talented beekeeper as well. And then with her is Justin, and Justin is a jack of all trades in beekeeping, a sideline and commercial beekeeper. They do, pollination, they do honey sales, nook sales, mentoring, ag exempt, anything in the bee world, Justin has done it. And then a special guest that I heard about just a minute ago is E.T. Ash, who just moved to California. So it's an honor. It's wonderful that you're here. So those of you that know ET know that he is a lifelong beekeeper, and there isn't anything he doesn't know about beekeeping. So
For
we're
sure.
thrilled to have you.
For sure.
Gonna be sitting in silence.
Us too, Ashley.
Me
Us
too. Me too. So, and then finally, of course, you guys all know Lauren. She has been on our webinars a handful of times, and she does everything in beekeeping too. So from ag exempt to consultations to sales, and she has worked for a lot of beekeeping companies. So there's, again, nothing she doesn't know. So
I try.
yes. Okay, so with that, we already have a ton of questions in here, and so I'm going to sort through them. And you guys, this is just a free for all, so feel free to just jump in, answer a question, and if any of the rest of you have something to add, and go for it. Laura asks for the panel, when should I treat with oxalic acid again? Should I wait till January? How should I use oxalic acid for winter mite treatments? So we have some oxalic experts on here, so I will let you guys answer that.
Lauren, take it away.
Yeah, Lauren, go ahead.
This isn't my thing, Justin. I just asked you about this.
Then it needs to be Justin.
Well,
So,
yeah,
Quick question, what form do you want to use it in? Do you want to use it in a dribble form, or are you trying to use it in a vape or a vaporization form? Because those treatments are a little bit different, and I don't like to do dribble whenever it's cold, but I'm more of a fan using the vape pretty much year round. I use the vape, or we use the vaporization form whenever we just need to do basically a quick knockdown. It's more of a tidy up than my number one, like, hey, this is my go-to. Instead, we use it, especially that we have honey supers on. We have we're increasing in mite count since you can use oxalic acid now. With honey supers on, it's kind of your go-to then. But also, if you are in a little bit warmer weather, like right now, it's not bad, but I prefer the dribble over the vape.
So if you're gonna pick a time, when would you say would be ideal?
To do a treatment again. If I'm going into fall/winter with threshold of 3 or below, I mean, I would do a mite check back in February, March, and then it's really depends on what your mites are looking at. Because I don't want to just blanket treatment and just treat to treat. I want to be able to treat some kind of ailment. So we want to see what our threshold is. And if we're over 3, maybe 5, depending on who you are and what you're doing, some people wait till they're at 8, and then it's time to treat. And then that's when you decide what form of treatment you're going to use.
So I would add, timing is what like oxalic is about, also about the brooding level in the hive at the point in time when you're treating. So as you're going into November, December, you have very little brood in the hive. Oftentimes one shot of oxalic vapor subliming oxalic is enough. If you get to the point of the year where you have more and more brood in the box, then you're probably going to have to be doing multiple treatments. And usually I've never really done multiple treatments because when I used it, I would always use it in the dead of winter. But most people are saying that you should treat in about a 7-day schedule, and oftentimes if the brood level gets high enough, you're probably going to be treating 4 times or basically every week for a month. So part of the timing is about the brooding level in the box, because basically the oxalic only will affect the adult varroa on bees and not in the cells. And you're waiting for the ones in the cells to come out and be adults, and when they are, they expose them again to oxalate.
Right.
If I could expound on that just a little bit, that was great, E.T. Most hobby beekeepers are going to be more inclined to use vaporization.
Mhm.
And we actually never encourage hobby beekeepers to go with the dribble method because it requires a little more finesse. But this is the time of year for OA. This is when it's at its best,
Mhm.
when our brood levels are down. And
Mhm.
as E.T. was saying, it's completely ineffective underneath the cell,
Right.
under the capping. So now is when you do it. So if you treated a week or 10 days ago and you've done another test and your levels are still above 2 or 3, then it's time to retreat again.
Mhm.
Not retreat, but retreat again. And I think that you'll find it all as well. Lauren wants to retreat.
I agree.
So let me throw out, there's a follow-up question, and this is a really common one we get a lot, but someone is asking, do any of you have experience or thoughts on the glycerin with oxalic acid on the shop towels or on the sponge that, Randy Oliver is often a big proponent of that. Any experience with that or thoughts?
We
from you
did
guys?
we did a mirror study. We were very lucky to get a mirror study with a youth that we had several years ago when Randy first did on the blue shop towels. If y'all remember that when Randy started with the glycerin and the blue shop towels. And we did a mirror study here in Southeast Texas while he was doing it in California. And we had terrible results with it. And it was probably more, and Randy concurred, more had to do with our environment. Our humidity level was so much higher than his and where he was. We didn't have much luck with it as he did.
Jennifer Baird study, I think, University of Georgia. I don't know. I can't remember. I'm bad at the university stuff, but I believe Barry did one and they didn't get good results. And I think also Randy did come out and say that it was a humidity issue and that they didn't get very good results. So I've jumped in and done it because everybody that was coming back a year or two later after the guy down in Argentina who was doing it, but he was using a cardboard applicator. And I never heard of anybody getting really good results. So I just stayed away.
So Randy's doing a sponge right now, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I would make a comment that I can't even remember how long ago this was, probably about the same time Randy was doing this. I was doing a study at let's just call it a undefined bee lab somewhere in the central part of the US. And basically oxalic and glycerin and the cardboard method. And basically we were testing ahead and behind, and there seemed to be a couple of other variables. And one of them was the degree to which the bees tended to have hygienic behavior, or the degree to which they tended to chew the piece of cardboard. So the ones that tended to really chew the cardboard up really quick, it seemed to have a pretty beneficial effect on them, and the ones who didn't, it didn't. It seemed like if the overall results now this was never published well, I won't say why it wasn't published, but anyway, anyway, when we did the study, what we kind of found out was, at least in the mid part of the season, the process had the tendency to keep the mite levels level, but they didn't really decrease the mite levels. They seemed to have kept them keep them from growing, but they didn't really decrease the mite level. They just kind of kept them at whatever level they were when we had tested at the front side of the experiment.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to switch topics a little bit. There's several questions relating to this topic, and I had it down for a question I wanted to ask you guys. So I'm really curious. This is kind of I'm going to call it a hot button issue right now in the beekeeping world. It's a trend. Well, trendy is probably a better word for it. But it's around insulating hives. And so I know, way back when and up in northern states, people used to wrap their hives in tar paper and put, black plastic on the outside, et cetera, to kind of insulate their hives. And it kind of fell out of popularity, and it seems to be coming back. And we've got some suppliers like I'm probably not saying it right, the Apamaya hives. I know that's not the right way to say it, but it's the hive box that is kind of super insulated. It kind of looks like a cooler that's very insulated. And there's a lot of theories behind, well, bees out in the wild live in a tree and that's super insulated, and we're putting them in this super thin wooden box. It's not natural for them. So there's a lot of questions around just like the pros and cons of doing something like adding just an insulation jacket and wrapping them in tar paper, all the way up to giving them some seriously heavy duty insulation, and if that's a good idea or not. So I'm curious, because I'm running my own tests and I'm seeing some interesting results, but I'm super curious to get all of your opinion on that.
I do have an opinion on that. I
Great.
can pipe in now. Like I don't do so much of the treatment. My bees are just out of luck sometimes. But yeah, so whenever I have, especially clients that are keeping their own bees, but have me as kind of a consultant, ask me about that. I tend to tell them, it's okay. But if they're especially in a panic, so say last February, where everyone's in a panic, I just tell them to leave them alone. They'll be fine, because it's so easy to mess it up. So it's not that I don't think there's some value that you can add with insulation. But if you're reacting to, a freeze tonight, you're more likely to trap condensation inside your hive and kill it. If you're fairly new, I would say that I think I've seen various places. I wish I could quote where, but insulation from the top, I'm way more comfortable with because it's harder to mess up, right? And so I think it's kind of like the folks that want to put sugar bricks on hives that probably have enough food. Like it's probably not going to hurt in that case. That's just my kind of 2 cents. I warn people to not go too extreme, especially if you're last minute kind of going out there and throwing tarps over things. It's a bad idea.
I'm definitely that whole, like, if you're worrying about your hives now and it's going to be freezing tonight, like you should have already done your preparation and kind of been prepared already. But whenever it comes down to insulating hives and stuff of that nature, I look at where we live. So I'm in Bryan College Station area, and it doesn't really get that cold here, right? And even with the freeze and stuff like that, there was an open air hive that I know of that survived the freeze, right? So I got something that's not in a box or a cavity at all, and it still went through the blizzard and came out on top and was still living. So I look at the insulation and things of that nature, like, yeah, up north, I could really see a benefit to it. But also, whenever you're talking about bee biology and kind of overwintering, you got to look at your torpor state, and you also got to think about your bees not hibernating per se, but torpor, and they go into that kick down, and they're not using as much food, and they're not being as active, and they kind of go into that slow metabolism, slow life, and they're not flying as much, and they're not running around the frames as much, and they're not using up as much resources and food. It's one reason that you want your bees to kind of go into a little bit of a cold state. So I have a feeling that you running your bees at a warm temperature the whole time and treating them like they're basically living in a subtropic, if they're living in an insulated hive, I think you're going to run through stores way quicker than just a normal everyday wood Langstroth.
What are you finding, Blake? You mentioned you've been kind of studying this a little bit just with your stuff. Are you seeing consistency there, or are we all wrong? I'm good. Hey.
No, yeah. I mean, I hate to share too much, because my main interest is to see what happens over winter, and winter's just getting started. There are some thoughts around even the insulation being beneficial during the summer, because the bees can more easily control the temperatures of the hive. And I did see that, the ones that I had some heavy duty insulation on, I was like, oh, great, they're going to overheat, and that wasn't the case. They seemed to do well. And so it's a little hard to tell right now. The ones that were insulated really, really well year round are a little bit ahead strength wise, but it's too early to tell. I think until January, February rolls around, it's really not a fair trial. So stay tuned.
I think that especially for hobby beekeepers, they need to keep in mind that honey is an insulator, that bees are putting honey on the outside frames of their hives. That's an insulator in itself. I know we're only about 100 miles from Ashley and Justin in Conroe, and what I'm convinced, saved our bees during Snowmageddon was that James went out and he moved the honey frames in and literally just encompassed the brood nest, flanked with honey, top, bottom, sides, all of it, where the resource was right there, and they were insulated, and we put wind blocks up. The first year we were beekeepers many years ago, we insulated a hive, and what happened?
Yeah, we successfully turned that colony into a terrarium.
We did.
And we went out when the cold was gone, and we had mold and algae growing.
We did.
And not very many bees present.
No.
They absconded during the cold weather.
And drowned.
And we learned a real lesson from that.
Yeah.
And we try to teach that lesson in our classes.
Yeah.
That hobby beekeepers quite often have a tendency to address a topic by adding something to a colony that's perfectly good.
Mm-hmm.
And what we end up doing is chasing our tail, trying to solve the problem that we created.
Yeah.
So we add tar paper, and then we put an upper entrance. We put an upper entrance, and we get robbing. We get robbing, and here we go. And all of a sudden, there's no end to the questions. So at least in our part of the state,
Right.
our bees are perfectly healthy in Southeast Texas,
Mhm.
and they can handle our winters.
I think what I'm hearing too is potentially not trying to invent your own solution, but if the hive has extra added R value, like if it's more insulated just naturally or by design, that makes sense, but not necessarily bringing in a bunch of plastics and tar papers and,
I think
Yeah.
everyone agrees.
I agree
we
with that.
have some, we got a free insulated styrofoam hive at the ABF thing. Like someone just sent it home with us because they didn't want to have to fly back with it.
Mhm.
And it does really well in both the winter and the summer because it stays cooler in the summer, it stays warmer in the winter without much effort, but we're not adding insulation to hives outside of what they were designed to have.
And that'd be cost prohibitive for you to run all those in your bee yard too. Yeah, a lot.
A bad idea.
And,
Yeah.
and what Blake was saying about the summer issue with the heat, I honestly worry more about dead outs and bees dying and losing hives in the summer than I do the winter. And I strongly feel that I don't like my hives to get super hot. So I'm a big fan of putting hives where after the sun is past noon or whatnot, it's in the shade. Just because the sun.
Unpopular opinion.
I know it's unpopular. People, oh, small hive beetles, and like it's supposed to be full sun and all that. But whenever it's 105 outside, I really like throw a little bit of shade on those hives, especially after 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock.
Well, and to be fair, we're not in swampland. Like we have humidity, but we're not in like swampy hive beetle land completely. So
I agree. So the closer I get to Austin, the more likely I have afternoon shade on my hives. I mean, I go more and more towards that. And I think it's kind of important to remember too, like all that insulation and whatnot, it usually isn't necessary. You might skew that way. If you have a tiny dink of a hive, you probably shouldn't be overwintering. And same deal in the summer. You think about, mating nukes, like, those are going to help more those hives that can't thermoregulate in the first place. So.
Cool. Great
question.
thoughts, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. So sticking with the theme of trending topics, there are several questions about sugar bricks, fondant, whatever you want to call them. And that's something, again, our northern friends tend to do a little bit more. And then I've seen a huge wave of more southern beekeepers now starting to do the sugar bricks, fondant, et cetera. What are your thoughts?
I prepped ET for this question.
There you go.
I said I was practicing to see how well he was gonna participate in a positive way, and he passed.
You know, everyone has a pet. It's not that you can't use sugar blocks and bricks and whatnot, but hopefully you don't need to. And we have such, like, almost every month of the year, you can pick a stretch of weather that's above 50 and give them a little bit of sugar syrup, even if they, even if they're kind of light. So, just don't mess it up. Just
Yeah.
have fun.
I think the question is really about, well, one, if you go further north, actually what's used is a candy board, and it's not a sugar brick. So it's actually inverted sugar. And the basic idea is you're going to go from maybe October, the latest, and not going to be opening the hive again until February or maybe March, and there's good reason not to break into the hive, because if you start breaking the seals, you're going to let in cold air. And so, a candy board or fondant or dry vert, makes a lot of sense in that context. And I guess if you're in the southern US, which basically is most of Texas, if you're one of these beekeepers who, you're going to, you're a hobby beekeeper, and you're not doing like Blake or me or any one of these people on the board, which is, you're not in the bees in December, you're not in them in February, you're not in them in January or February. You're going from November until sometime in the spring, when you're finally going to get around to opening the box again. A sugar brick probably makes some sense, since it's a certain amount of insurance there. So if you're in that context of
I don't want to touch them.
you don't have the time to touch one or two hives in the backyard. You're not like any of the people on this board who are in and out of bees, every week, every day. A sugar brick is good insurance. There's nothing wrong with the idea, as long as it's like a lot of things. There's nothing wrong with the idea as long as it's applied properly.
Mm-hmm.
But
I agree.
The hope would be, like you said, Lauren, that you don't need it because your bees have enough of, and Blake did a great job talking about how much you should have in a hive to kind of get them through this winter time. And obviously that can change depending on the weather in Texas, which we all know is unpredictable. But at the end of the day, it isn't a horrible insurance, but it could be a lot of effort that you don't necessarily have to have if you have good practices leading to the winter.
And I guess that's what I was trying to get at, is for people with a couple of hives in their backyard, a lot of time they want to do something that feels good. Honestly, that feels like they're doing something for their bees. And that's one of the things I don't consider a threat that they can kind of do. Although I have seen someone put their fondant in their feeder where it got condensation, went to goo, and just killed a lot of bees.
Yeah.
I'm
as we speak, working on doing an article on this, because on social media, and I know that some of you are on social media, right? Justin, you beat Ashley on social media.
I'm not on.
I know, that's what I said. Justin beats you. He does, totally. And Lauren, every once in a while, see you. But it's really popular. It's really popular. There's actually a class at the TVA convention about this. Stan Gore is teaching, and I'm intrigued by it. But when I spent entirely, I can't tell my boss this, but I spent entirely too much time reading article after article after article on on sugar bricks. Well, sugar bricks are, like everyone here is saying, are for northern states. They are not talking about down here, and nearly all of them are the same recipe, and they have the same, we have a moisture board and we do this and we do that, and none of it is applicable to Southeast Texas or even Texas in general. So, but I appreciate that somebody wants to do that. And if it's working for you, and hey,
Yeah.
if it's not hurting your
And you have the
bees,
time and the.
that's right.
Yep.
I say go for it. Don't know what my article's gonna look like, but it's gonna be in there somehow.
Well, I agree with all that, and that I look forward to attending Stan's class.
I do
because
too.
He has a unique take on his
He
presentation
does. He
that
does.
we're excited to hear.
I think he looks at it, like you said, ET, as insurance more than anything. It's
It
just
is.
like, okay, they're in there and I can rest more peacefully knowing that they've at least got that. But the sad thing is there are times when they have honey in their hives and they still starve or freeze. So, nothing is going to be perfect 100% of the time.
That's right.
So someone asked a question directly for ET related to this. They said, ET, what do you think about the baked sugar bricks with pollen and honeybee healthy mixed in with them? So you're kind of getting the sugar, the pollen, essential oils, etc., all in one.
Oh, whoa.
That's so much. That sounds like a luxury meal.
Well, it's probably okay. I mean, it's kind of back to the thing, if it works for them. I mean, if I had some question, if I was doing it myself, and I had 100 hives, I might try it on 5 and see how it worked. And if it worked, I would probably, maybe next year do it on all the hives. I don't know. I usually, if it's something that's kind of questionable in my mind, I tend to not apply it to all the hives I have. Something goes wrong, it's like you're kind of wagering that you're going to lose or do something that's really negative, and you're going to start chasing a problem that you've created yourself, and that's never good. So there's probably nothing wrong with it. I see people to do that. I've never tried it myself. Probably wouldn't try it myself because I'm more in line with prepping the bees, before winter gets here, and then,
Give them a break.
and then just, and no breaks. And
No, I said give them a break.
I'll give them a break. I'll give them a break.
A brick on top.
A brick on top.
They take
A
the
real
brick.
brick.
Acme.
Probably nothing wrong with the idea, and the honeybee healthy tends to be a appetite enhancer. And my question really in Texas with all these kinds of products is, at least where I am, or at least where I was in Texas, we have a lot of problem with ants, and not sure how attractant these things might be to ants, and basically trying to figure out how to get ants out of a hive once you've got them in there is a real problem. So, I'm not sure.
Perfect. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, let's switch topics a little bit here. Someone's asking what all of your opinion is on where is the industry and how close are we to developing Varroa resistant queens that I'm going to say, or I'm going to add in, or are readily available and successful?
That's a Lauren answer.
Oh, you should have asked me this last year. So, and I don't know, I talked to Justin a little bit, but what y'all's experiences were, who run a decent number of bees, but it was a rough year. I kind of feel like, not everywhere, right? But across a lot of Texas, I feel like we had kind of these long brood buildups, not good nutrition, but I feel like they raised a lot of mites. I feel like they raised them sooner in a lot of places. And so am I kind of scraping by with resistant tolerant queens? Yes. Am I considering adding oxalic into my repertoire for some of these, yes, because it was a harder year, and I don't know if I'm going to blame queens. I'm definitely going to blame weather patterns for the majority.
Yeah, and nutrition.
Nutrition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nutrition.
And the nutrition that kind of made, we had kind of that cool, wet summer. And I feel like most of the time, as a person that has been completely treatment free, other than doing an oxalic dribble on a couple of my own hives, I feel like in the past, you get to July and August, and those bees hit a wall. And I, as a treatment free beekeeper, I like that wall because I feel like that's when they do all the housekeeping. So your VSH behaviors like really come out then, because the brood shrinks down, nothing's coming in. So that queen's not laying much, but they deal with the mites then all at once. And by September, I have low mite counts and good looking brood again in most of those hives. And if I don't, I've requeened. This year it was a lot harder to save them with what should have been a good queen. And they also were still struggling last month, which is not where you want to be. So do we have bees that can generally, resist mites? Yes, they do exist. But even if you go with, say the most reputable people producing these, are they going to do it 100% of the time? No, I hate to say it, but no. Especially those second year queens. So you'll, with a queen that both produces bees that have a lot more resistance to the diseases, that's really the big one to me, all the viruses, but also has behaviors to get rid of mites, especially VSH, but other behaviors on top of that. You can get by the first year, but those second year queens this year really struggled. And some of them, it's just now that they've gotten on top of things. And so it's a different outlook. So it can be done, but sometimes you're sad. So, and then I have some really good yards too. So it's not all doom and gloom, but like I said, some years better than others. This one was kind of rough. This one tested, put it that way. Next year, I've got breeders to point out to people because I know who my rock stars were now for sure, because this one tested them.
Well, at least for this particular weather pattern, you had rock stars, right? So sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, just high mites, just like I knew all their neighbors were going to have high mite loads and they were going to have to deal with it. Yeah. So, but yeah, so it can be done. I'm still doing it. Just questioning some of my choices, just sometimes. So, what about you, E.T.?
Well, we've come a long way.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that if probably we had more people doing we could probably make better strides at the problem. My attitude over time was the mites were less of a problem than the viruses associated with the mites. And of course, as we're finding, as we should know in any of these, viral problems, nutrition plays a part in how populations deal with viruses. And so, you get in seasons like this year, which basically was not good in the springtime and it wasn't good in the summertime, wasn't much better in the fall. The problems that come along with the viruses and the mite loads, it just compounds itself. And so we've come a long way, and some of us will keep, struggling at the impossible task, but I don't think there's anything wrong with taking an intermediate path either. Lauren talks about using oxalic, and certainly if you get to the time of the year where you've had one of these bad years and your mite loads are real high, well, this may be a perfect time to intervene and at least knock the mite loads down to where come springtime you have some surviving units, so I still think it's a doable thing. It was never going to be easy. But some of us, love to kind of pull on something that's kind of seems impossible. And so we're getting there, but it's not going to happen overnight. So
there's still Go ahead, Lauren.
I will say too, like I said, I know it sounded like I've lost a ton of hives. It's not really been that. It's just that I've struggled against it. And what you have to understand is that there is a trade-off even with those really resistant queens. And so what I'll see a lot of the time is, your population is down with them having to pull out so much brood, throwing out mites. But a lot of it is, you go back and your honey stores have been run through, and that's a mite, effect as well. So it's not all that the hive has outright died. It's just those resistant queens sometimes have a harder time, and everything else suffers a little bit more. So your production overall, every aspect of that suffers a little. So
I just want to, I guess, tie it all up and say that to answer that question, I think that the question as it was presented is, are there still, they're still working on it. Everything I've read is there is great deal of money going into research and those AI, what ET had said, artificial insemination of ensuring and building the genetics to get some super quality VSH queens to the market that are affordable and really and truly are. And I think we all believe this eventually might be the be all end all for it. And I'll just give a segue that next month, the December issue, Blake and Lauren, those two are doing an article on if I don't treat my bees, do they become resistant to varroa mites? So it's going to be a good article. Y'all can look forward to reading, and it has good information. Remember that interview, Lauren? Yeah.
No.
I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, I forgot about that.
Y'all do know, you do know that I'm in your computers every day.
Okay.
Okay, so I want to ask just one more broad question for everybody, and then let's try to do some rapid fire to get through a lot of the questions just quickly. But the last kind of broad one for everyone, just to give your thoughts and opinions, are what kind of losses should you expect? So if you're a newer beekeeper or even a sideline or more experienced beekeeper, and you're wondering what's normal, what should winter losses look like, or even annual year-round losses?
I mean, my go-to is 30%. If I'm losing less than 30%, I'm doing just fine. And I personally like to see a 10 or 15%, and that's what I really want to stick around. But as long as I'm not suffering anything over 30%, I can definitely recoup. I can recover very easily. I'm not stressing.
And even expand.
I'm not like, oh my gosh, my business is going to fail. And that's what I kind of see in any hobbyist that I help with. We look at, I say, look, you got 3 hives, one of them dies. That's basically your 30%. And we kind of manage into any time we're talking about where they want to be. I always just say, hey, just think that you're probably going to lose 1 out of every 3. And that's not saying that's going to be in the winter time, because we do see a lot of the losses in the summertime whenever we start getting high levels of varroa, especially in the month of like July and August. So that's mine.
So I'll jump in here after, and that way. Anyway, I think that's a good number, 1/3. Jumping back into the idea of management, I think I heard Blake mention this earlier. The old adage was you were better off taking your losses in the fall than taking them in the winter, which basically meant that anything that was a dink that you knew was not going to survive the next spring, you combined it with another hive, usually something to add strength of one to the other. So it's like 1/3 is kind of the number I always ran off of. And basically the 20 years when I was raising bees here in Central Texas, I never really treated bees. So I kind of thought that the number was a bit high, and actually, even when I had this, I could stand 1/3 loss, actually my numbers were growing. So it was actually, you could probably have a loss a little bit higher than that and it would have been fine. I think the critical part that Justin just mentioned is 1/3 is okay as long as you have 3 hives. 1/3 may not be so good if you have 1 hive.
That's right.
If you have, come springtime, if you have 2, you can make up the 1 real easy, but if you have 1 and you're down to 0, then, well, you're back to finding somebody like me or Justin or Blake or any of these people on the board who, basically sell bees. You're back in the business, you have to buy some more bees, so.
Yeah.
And that's such a variable when we talk about losses. You almost have to decipher who are you as a beekeeper? What are you willing to do as a beekeeper, preventative wise?
Yep.
How well do you understand nutrition and disease and how that affects the fat bee, skinny bee? The whole concept of beekeeping can kind of go into a spiral in that the 2 colonies, maybe the 1/3 actually ended up with a weak colony that you're overwintering, which means you lost all 3 of them. So it kind of varies depending upon who you are. Commercial wise, the quantities y'all can adjust according to what your individual goals are. But the small scale beekeeper that allows their bees to swarm and spread the mites and all the little things that happen, those numbers can
100%.
drastically go up.
Again,
The
50%.
importance of education in beekeeping.
Oh, I want to explain dink. Y'all have used that and we know what it is, but I don't know that everybody knows what a dink is. A dink, I'm going to explain it to those that don't, the several hundred people that are watching. A dink, for those that don't know, is dinky. It's just it's a real fancy term, dinky. And in the commercial world or in the beekeeping industry, a dink is just a weak hive. So that was a glossary word for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and there's still a lot of questions that we didn't have time to get to. So let me just run through some of these, and if just one of you, it doesn't matter who, just wants to grab this question and just one of you answer, then we can just kind of burn through some of these to try to get most of them answered. Somebody asked, it's about pollen patties, and they've been told to wait until cold weather to give pollen patties. Otherwise, it'll attract too many small hive beetles. They lost a bunch of hives last year due to small hive beetles and moths. When is it too soon to feed pollen patties, or when should you feed pollen patties?
Go for it.
I think as a hobbyist, I know you guys sell pollen patties and talk about using pollen patties, but I'm a firm believer if you're a hobbyist and you're not trying to do early brood raising, that you shouldn't be using pollen patties. You shouldn't need to use pollen patties because pollens, especially in my area, is available year round almost in the state, in my part of the state of Texas. Even in December, they're going to bring in mistletoe and stuff. So I don't feel that it's necessary on the hobbyist level. But that's just my opinion.
Okay, we should have skipped Justin.
Yeah, I know.
I told him not to.
I'm kidding. I'm
The
kidding.
wrong person answered.
Wrong answer, Justin.
Let's talk about some bottom boards. No,
I don't want to jump in on it, even though it's just one part.
Maybe he's
We
like,
feel
yeah.
like if you want to use it, then use small strips,
Yeah.
whatever a colony will consume within a 2 or 3 day period.
Yeah.
And if they tore it up and you want to do it again, then double that.
Mhm.
Just keep an eye out for your small hive beetle larvae.
Just little bits at a time.
It's kind of one of those,
and I
if you like it, what the heck.
yeah, and it was certainly in jest. I mean, there are a lot of people that don't like pollen patties. What I always tell folks is try it on half your bees and don't on the other half, and see what works in your area. Regions differ, management styles differ. Try it out, and if it doesn't work for you, don't use it. So yeah.
And we're picking on you, Justin.
Sorry, Justin. Okay, so here's someone that says they've got a really aggressive hive. Towards the end of summer, they would chase them, for 20 minutes after doing an inspection. They're incredibly strong. Seems like it always works out that way. And they're great producers of honey. Should I let them live or should I kill them?
I want to answer that.
yeah, go ahead.
The TBA convention and go to your class, Blake.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll
That's
tell you
right.
how to solve it.
He said, yeah, go to Blake's class. But I'll say we had a very bad, very bad, good hive, good bad hive. worst bees we've ever had. And we won blue ribbon honey at the Texas Beekeeper Association convention from the honey came from that bean hive. So don't kill it.
Also, considering the fact that it was the end of the summer, they had a lot of honey stores. Some of that is playing into how aggressive they were. I would check the mite count. If it was high, they could have been irritable. If they had a lot of honey to defend, they could have been irritable. The whole 20 minutes after a hive inspection is a little much.
About 3 days.
Probably not passed well in my book, but there could be other factors before I completely made that decision that I would try to resolve before I decide what to do with them. If they continued to be aggressive, I would at least bust them down into 3 or 4 hives, large ones. So there you go.
Yeah, there's power in numbers in the bee world as well.
Yeah, it's
I
a
know
lot.
we're going fast, but
All mean hive.
yeah. But like, if you can leave that hive alone until next spring, I'd do that.
Right. Yeah.
Don't touch it. It'll be fine.
Break it down if you have to next spring.
Yes. Thank you,
Great.
Lauren.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, that was a great answer. Okay, here's a fun one for somebody. Is there such a thing as organic honey? So many people are always asking me, is your honey organic? Especially living in prime apple growing territory, they say. So is there organic honey?
Yes, there is. And you can get some in Colombia or
Brazil.
maybe Bolivia. There's and probably some places in Central America, you may be able to get some really organic.
I think Blake's
I don't
honey
think- I
company
don't-
sells some from, don't you, Blake? Don't you sell organic honey?
We don't anymore. We used to sell from Brazil, but we stopped because Texas honey was just so much better. So yeah.
Great answer.
So I think the actual answer to finish is it not here in Texas
Or the United States.
or the United States, because there's not enough land mass that is untreated in one place to be able to technically honey organic. Now, you could say you practice organic practices. You could say that you on your land have organic practices, but you cannot control what your neighbor does. And so technically you shouldn't claim you have organic honey. But you can also explain that there, so it's fine.
Yeah. And that's what I usually do, is explain the logic behind it, that you're not going to get that from the United States. Most people have no idea that most of the honey we consume is imported, and they see organic honey in the grocery store and they just assume it's from the United States. And so I always try to explain to people that, hey, that's from another country. And yes, it can be organic. And if that's important to you, buy it, but you need to make sure you know it's not local. So someone says, they mentioned a name, but I'm not gonna mention the name. Someone had a Facebook entry recently that using creosote bush in your smoker will help deter varroa mites. Anyone have an opinion? I'd never heard of that before, so I don't know.
I do too.
I have no idea. I guess I am missing the
I'm gonna
Facebook.
go look.
So anyway, I think they actually, in the Facebook link, they actually had a link to, there's some people in Europe who are trying different products in the smoker to somewhat deter the mite problem. And cedar bark, I think, is one of them. Sumac, the I don't know, the floral ends of sumac is another one. But there's a link in that same Facebook page that
Staghorn.
talks about people in Europe actually testing these to see if they have any mite effect or not.
I don't have any.
So anyway, I would suggest that they go and read that and make a conclusion for themselves. Creosote bush is easy to get if you live in southern New Mexico or very western Texas, but probably would not be easy to acquire here. So,
Drilling down to the realities of how practical that is, we can speculate that those approaches would not penetrate the brood cell, which means that they would not kill the larva. They've not killed the mites that are inside the larva. So all they're killing with them would be phoretic mites. And if you wanted to smoke it 24 hours a day, you would have no new phoretic mites come into the colony there to lay their eggs. So I don't see where it offers a lot of future possibilities. Of course, I'm not a scientist, but from what my limited knowledge is, I can't see where it's a practical approach. Don't be breathing poison ivy or poison sumac through your smoker.
Yeah. Okay, last question, and then we'll call it a night. Someone asked, this is just a really good practical one. It seems too intrusive to test for mites while it's cold outside. So when do you test during the winter? Should you test before and after an oxalic treatment if it's cold? Kind of what are the parameters for doing those tests in cooler months?
Well, I can say that you could, if you didn't want to be intrusive, you could do a mite drop, a sticky board. You're just not going to get that good an accurate count. Right now, it's November. We still have, just because it was cold today and we're dressed like Nanook from the north, it's going to be warm again. There's still perfect opportunities to do an accurate, sugar shake or or alcohol, whatever you want to do. But if you want to be less intrusive, just do a sticky board.
Yeah, I don't think
There
it's
you
enough to avoid doing it. If you haven't done a mite check yet, ideally you would do those mite checks July, August, September. But here we are. You might as well know what you're doing now, or what you have going into winter now, so that if anything happens to your hives, or if there's something you can address today, you can deal with it. But you have something as a baseline for how your bees are looking in the spring too.
So I
Yeah.
would say my parameters would be 55 degrees plus, and hopefully with the sun coming out. 60 degrees is always, to me, has always been the optimal temperature to work bees. They're still somewhat clustering, so they're somewhat tight.
And then just don't get your queen and your
Just make sure you don't get your queen in there.
Way easy.
So anyway, it's more of a
Yes.
temperature thing, and you can have 60-degree weather in November, December, January, February, March. So it shouldn't be really limited to the time of year, but you probably don't want to do it when it's 40 or 45 degrees. Would be my,
Like if the bees, I was going to say, if the bees don't fly, let them lie.
That's right.
There you go. Good one. Well, guys, thank you so much. And I know you can't see the interaction that I'm getting to see through the chat and the Q&A, but folks are really enjoying and have really enjoyed all your answers. And you can see all of us at the TBA conference this weekend if you want to come. And but thank you to our panel. You guys were phenomenal. You can check out the panelists. You can check out the chat and see all the wonderful comments people are making and all the thank yous. But we really, really appreciate you. That was really, really awesome. So just yes, thank you guys. Yes, see you in Galveston.
See you in Galveston.
There you go. And
Bye.
for everybody else, we'll be sending out that recording in a couple of days. We'll email the recording out of this webinar, and you can also check it out on our website or YouTube. And we will see you guys after Thanksgiving in December. So I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your year, and we look forward to seeing you in 4 weeks.